Hello and welcome to Suzi's Book Bag, the first issue of the year 2024. We've been doing Book Bag for nearly a year now, had an awful lot of fun, and as promised, there'll be lots of wonderful writers coming up this year for you to learn all about. We ended the year with the Book Bag. I can't stop laughing when I say this. The baggies. The baggies are the Book Bag prizes of the year. Best book of the year, best novel, best poetry collection, and so on. So it's a lot of fun putting that together. Just to remind you, the book of the year was Chris Lotaris's amazing book about Shakespeare's first folio called Shakespeare's Book. So everybody who is on this year, including my next guest, will potentially be up for a baggie. And if anybody wanted to sponsor Britain's most exciting new book awards, do please get in touch. So I have got the Abacus book bag up there because I shall be talking to an Abacus author, actually a bit of a prize winner himself, or certainly nominated for lots of prizes. It is the very wonderful Keiran Goddard. Welcome to the Book Bag.
Hi Suzi, thanks for having me.
You're very, very welcome. We are going to be talking about, well, both your novels, but this book just came out. I See Buildings Fall Like Lightning, and it was launched last week at a pretty spectacular party, I have to say.
Yeah, you're always sort of simultaneously worried that no one will come and that too many people will come, and we definitely erred more towards the latter of those, I think. So it was very fun. I felt very pleased that so many people turned out to support the book.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a veteran of book parties, so this really was a cracker. And one of the funny things is so many people squeezed into quite a small venue in Soho. So you're obviously thinking maybe 10 people would turn up, but the coat rack collapsed in the coat room with the press of bodies. And you couldn't really move around very much. I did try to force my way through, but as I talked to people about you, a lot of people said, "Oh yeah, I know Keiran socially," which sort of, you know, seems like you're very much a kind of, you know, Soho maverick, or, you know, you get about a bit, you've got lots of friends. Anyway, it was a great party.
Oh well, I'll take that. It's nice to have friends.
So your first novel, Hourglass, I'm going to read a couple of things that I wrote about it in the FT because I thought it was absolutely terrific. And you might not even agree with what I'm going to say, but anyway, this was from my review. This is a tale of male solipsism told in aphorisms rather than a conventional love story. A story of doomed romance as touching as it is abstract, which would mean it's good for Valentine's Day, which is when we're going to put up this interview. So, yeah, what do you think of that? Male solipsism. Was that the effect you were aiming for?
I'm going to have to say yes. It would be a shame if that was accidental. No, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the motivations behind that book was to really explore what it would be like to write a kind of unmediated account of desire. And with that comes all of the ways in which desire distorts you, right? And it distorts people in various ways, including, I think, but not limited to, creating a kind of deep emotional solipsism. You know, suddenly, you know, in the grips of desire, and everything is about you and your relationship to this, you know, object of desire. You know, songs are about you. Suddenly you're a symbologist and a numerologist, and you know, you're vibrating with sort of signals from the universe, telling you that you're entirely correct in all of your assumptions. So I really wanted to just keep pushing on that. you know, and all the ways that that can become absurd, and all the ways it can become uncomfortable, and disordering, actually, like psychologically disordering, socially disordering. So yeah, I think that's completely fair.
Maybe it's not good for Valentine's Day then. Maybe
it's the thinking person's Valentine's present.
Right. Okay. A kind of overthinking person's Valentine's Day.
Sure.
So it is written, you know, as I kind of put it, in aphorisms. And it was interesting in your Guardian piece. You've written a very interesting Guardian piece where you're looking at contemporary fiction by young writers, and questioning, you know, in one way, the whole history of the novel. Why is it so bourgeois? Why is it about getting married to somebody with 3,000 a year or whatever back in the day? But you said something about because of the stresses on writers and how very difficult it is to earn a living and so on, it's no surprise that young writers are writing shorter books, more fragmentary books. Was that how you kind of framed the style of Hourglass, or did it just come about that way?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think I made that point in the article as a suggestion. I mean, I certainly don't think it's the answer. I'd just seen a number of quite very reasonable but quite high-minded explanations for the growth of a kind of auto-fiction fragmentary trend, all of which I think are partially true. But and maybe this is my politics speaking, but I just thought there was a material dimension missing to the analysis. You know, books are ultimately kind of products of work. You know, they're printed on paper, which costs money. You know, they're edited by human beings who require salaries, and they're increasingly written by people who, you know, have to earn their money doing, you know, increasingly intensified labor in the day. So I just thought it was a kind of missing piece of the puzzle. You know, why should they be different from any other product within an economy, and be immune from the material pressures and dynamics that surround it? So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there, really, you know, as it related to the sort of broader economic questions. In terms of my personal use of that form in Hourglass, I mean, I think it's a kind of hierarchy issue for me. I mean, I started out writing collections of poetry, and I'm generalizing massively here, so, you know, forgive me, but there's something like a hierarchy in prose writing sometimes, where, you know, you may have like plot, character, dialogue, and then somewhere maybe slightly lower down you may have symbol, rhythm, metaphor. Whereas you might argue that in poetry that hierarchy is inverted somehow. Now, in my prose writing, I tend to have kept something like the more poetic hierarchy, where image and rhythm and repetition, chorus, these issues remain primary to me, and they remain the primary kind of dynamics and drivers of my writing, even when it's in prose. So Hourglass was a kind of like a natural, it felt like quite a natural evolution, you know, away from poetry and towards, you know, towards prose, although obviously I do think of it as a prose novel, but it retains some very sort of poetic elements, I guess.
And how did you structure it? Because, you know, it does build, as I indicated in the review, that it's like a mosaic that you put together the story and you see where it's going. Was that always in your mind, or did you move things about a bit as you
yeah, there was sorry, a little delay there. There's definitely a schema for the book, and as Ron Seal as this sounds, I was actually looking at an hourglass, and I thought, what a strange object, you know, an hourglass is in some ways, because it's the only sort of time-telling object that shows you like the past, the present, and the future all at once. You know, it's kind of, you can see all the time that's past at the bottom, all the time that's to come, you know, at the top, and then the present is just this tiny little bit in the middle, which is like passing, you know, whereas most clocks just show you the middle bit, right? They just show you the present time, which of course, you know, is pretty much all we can ever be in at any given point. So I have this idea.
We can only ever be in that pinch point. We can't be in
yeah,
this bit or that bit ever.
Exactly, that's right. So I thought, firstly, what would happen if I equalized all three bits of that? So I made past, present, and future sort of equal import. So I did the three sections, which are roughly past, present, future. They each have the same amount of subsections in, and each subsection has roughly the same amount of words in it. And at one point, each section had an identical amount of words in each section. Although I'm afraid to say that during the editing process, that slightly slipped. And then there are you may remember there are kind of fictional essays in the book that the narrator produces, with word counts attached to them, and all of the word counts, I won't sort of spoil it, and I don't suppose anyone really cares, but all of the word counts actually relate to the kind of inner numerology of Hourglass itself. So each of them kind of map on in different ways. So yeah, it was pretty involved, as you know, as a schema, and also of course gave me a great a great out with my editor, because I could always say I could change that if you wanted to destroy the entire structure of the book. So yeah, it was definitely, there was some real planning that went into that.
I mean, that sounds a very poetic way of doing it, like that you own the page, you own exactly how it appears. You know, you own the white space as much as you own the words on the page. So it does just feel like a poetic way of structuring and thinking, indeed. But this book, the follow-up, is very different. But I guess once you've done something like Hourglass, you know, you can't just do it again. You have to do something different. So this is the book we're talking about. Could you tell me a bit about the title to begin with?
Yeah, of course. So it's a biblical reference in essence, and it's from Luke, and it's when Satan is cast out of heaven, and the line in the Bible is, "I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven." And then that title was, that line from the Bible was used by the sort of brilliant but controversial philosopher René Girard in his book I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, which was a study of, well, it's actually very long to explain, but a study of the scapegoat mechanism, effectively. So how desire is produced mimetically and then reproduced in society, and how periodically scapegoats are kind of sacrificed in order to discharge all of the animus in society that's built up through mimetic desire. And he uses that as an analytical framework to explore a lot of things. So I was very taken, firstly with the language of it, which I just think is very beautiful, but with this idea of mimetic desire, jealousy, you know, how we create this sense of worth or lack in our own lives, our own perceptions of ourselves relative to what we see in others, but also this sense that somebody has to be sacrificed, you know, that someone is going to go, that we're all on this wire and someone has to go. And then the building element of that, I wanted to link that sense of desire, that trepidation, firstly into our relationship to property, relationship to home, and second into this kind of leitmotif that's in the novel, which is the act of kind of seeing buildings be blown up, you know, which I saw a lot as a kid. It was a lot of entertainment for us. We'd go and watch these old council tower blocks be blown up and replaced by, you know, new build housing, and you'd watch them collapse into their footprint. It was this incredible spectacle. Kind of hundreds of us would go and watch these yeah, these council tower blocks be blown up. And I obviously didn't know at the time because I was just a kid and I liked seeing things get blown up. But they've since kind of lingered with me in various ways. Like, firstly, as this sort of melancholy death of a sort of post-war dream of a different way of organizing, you know, community, a different way of organizing society that wasn't sort of value engineered for profit. And then also they really recurred to me again and again around the horrors of Grenfell and the sort of horrible ironies of those two images kind of interacting with one another. So that's a very long answer, but it was a kind of, you know, a kind of gestalt really of all of those things that drew me to the title.
Some of your characters have done exactly the same thing, and think about buildings being destroyed, and indeed think about buildings being built up again, and what it means. I noticed that in your little biog, you grew up in Birmingham. I've spent many happy times in Birmingham, but I've never come across Shard End. Is that because people just don't really go to Shard End unless they have business there?
Yeah, it could well be. I mean, the first thing I have to say about Shard End is that it's a real place. And although I lived there until, you know, I was sort of 17, 18, and although I lived very near a shop that did double glazing, and the shop was called Shard End Glass, it still never occurred to me that Shard End was a strange name for a place, you know, a kind of violent, aggressive, you know, piece of glass. And it was only when I kind of went to university and sort of mentioned it to a friend, and they were like, well, that's not what it's really called though, surely. But it is, in fact. And it's yeah, it's a post-war housing estate that's turned into an area. It's changed since I left, but at the time I grew up, it was slightly atypical of other parts of Birmingham in that it lacks a lot of the multiculturalism that Birmingham has. You know, Birmingham was shaped by, you know, Windrush, and also by, you know, South Asian immigration in the 70s and 80s. My school was very, you know, very mixed, but Shard End wasn't. It was 98% white. It had like a very strong BNP, NF type presence, later UKIP. I believe councillors were actually elected. So it was a kind of angry place. It was quite monocultural, plenty of beauty, plenty of brilliance, but you had to kind of squint to see it. And of course, as a kid, you don't see it till you leave. You know, you want to, you do anything to leave, and then you spend the rest of your life longing for it, you know, in complicated ways.
Is this book set in a kind of Shard End? Were you drawing on, and you know, it's about 5 characters who are friends since they were tiny kids, and the experiences they share as they're growing up. Were you reliving a bit of your youth with all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to give a sort of more kind of literary answer to that, but the answer is basically yes. And it's not necessarily Shard End in particular. Like it's very deliberately not named. You know, the place. There are sort of 2 primary places in the book. There's a kind of center of economic and cultural gravity, and then there's the other place. You know, and I think every area has a Shard End, and most areas have a relationship, you know, whether it be of desire or of antagonism to, you know, this central place where people go, you know, where people leave. And that's a big part of the, you know, that I'm exploring in the book, is this kind of really pernicious social mobility myth that to succeed means to leave. You know, that if you do well, that means you leave. And really the deep heartbreak that underpins that I've been thinking about more and more recently, which is just that it creates this dynamic within families even, where some mothers and fathers basically have to say, I love you so much that I have to accept that you'll be better without me and elsewhere. There's a kind of having to push the thing and person you love most out of the door almost. There's this kind of millions of acts of kind of familial sacrifice that I think is one of the great pains, psycho-emotional pains of poverty that never gets talked about, or doesn't get talked about enough. Maybe it's a very hard thing to talk about, but it's something I've been thinking about, and it's something that's definitely present in the book, I think.
You have one character who does escape, in a sense, and becomes very successful, but in another sense, he doesn't escape at all. So, in talking about the characters, let's begin with him. Is it Rian or Ryan? Rian?
Rian.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Rian is the kind of the archetype of like local lad done good, I guess. And he leaves. He essentially goes to make money. He has a skeptical, almost political, amoral relationship to the sort of circumstances that shaped him. He's very much, well, if you can't beat them, join them, is his essential philosophy. But of course, and every human has a version of learning this, in their own life. You are always there. You take yourself with you, and whatever lack you feel, there isn't really enough nice suits to fill that hole, right? There aren't enough Hermes ties in existence to soothe the human soul. So he has what all of the characters have, which is something, this notion of a cleaving, really, which is this, the double meaning of that, which is to split apart, but also to hold on. So he's forever trying to kind of, he leaves to find home, and then he leaves again to find home, I guess. It's
5 characters, 4 guys, 1 gal, and 2, Patrick and Shiv are in a relationship, which is kind of hugely envied by everybody else. But because Shiv is certainly thinking, I've never been with anybody else but this guy who I have known since I was this big. And there's a little bit of a sort of, is this really the right thing, even in the midst of happiness? But I was talking to an agent, this is a while ago, about what's selling in the market, what narratives people want to read. And it was very interesting because she said, guys, nobody wants to read about the male psyche anymore. It's women, it's psychological fiction, women's psychological thrillers. I guess she was looking at what's going to sell big. But how would you answer that or think about that? Because these guys, they're kind of very sensitive, emotional guys in lots of ways, aren't they?
They are, yeah. They're all kind of open wounds, really, like all of the characters. In fact, I'd say Shiv is the least like that. She's the kind of wisest, like earthiest character. I think she's the most pragmatic. There's a section in which he sort of says something along the lines of, but that's the thing, isn't it? You have to love every part of someone, like even the broken bits of them, and then you have to like carry the broken bits of them around with you in your hands, like even if they might cut you. And she just goes on, and she's the one who I think kind of keeps that anchor in. On your broader point, and I mean risk of alienating my industry, I just do not buy that at all. I think it's very, very lazy analysis. I'm not saying that you can't draw those conclusions from the data. You clearly can, but I think it confuses, on the one hand, serving a market, and on the other hand, making a market. And I don't think you can simultaneously hold the view that, on the one hand, only women read, or like literary fictions for women, and on the other hand, people only like to read about people they identify with. because otherwise you've just created a feedback mechanism where if it's true that people only want to read who they identify with, and you're only producing books about female psychology, then you're going to perpetuate a system in which people only, only those readers exist. I also think more important than that, because I don't think it's necessarily a gender question. I think it's a question about a consolidation of an industry that requires predictable returns, that it can model over time in order to serve shareholder value. And in the process of doing so, massively underestimates readership generally. I think the idea of a general reader is embarrassing, and it's patronizing, and it's historically illiterate. And you only have to look at some of the most successful cultural objects of all time to see that people have a taste for the difficult and the strange and the weird. Dark Side of the Moon is one of the biggest selling records of all time. For a long period, Radiohead were the biggest band in the world. People didn't know they wanted Nirvana, and on and on and on. There's a million examples. So I think it's a lie that the industry tells itself to make its job easier, bluntly.
So what sort of, another thing that the industry says, and the industry does try to kind of educate and shape things. I remember a few years ago there was the boys don't read, boys aren't reading, how can we get boys to read? And in a way J.K. Rowling played a part in this. And there were many books like the Cherub series that are kind of really violent and thrilling, and boys like excitement, they don't like ghosts or gothic or emotion, what do you make of all of that? There has been a real effort to get boys to read, but again, is it kind of looking at the wrong thing? Is it starting with categories that don't really exist if you look at them hard enough?
Yeah, I think the difficulty is, it's not that the categories don't exist. It's that they only exist within a certain paradigm, which is the paradigm of marketing product to defined channels. So we've internalized all of this kind of, it's not just the logic of publishing, it's the logic of, kind of neoliberal industry, basically. But then we repeat it as though it is true outside of that paradigm. And of course, that's where everyone sort of shakes their head, because they all know deep down that that's people on kind of monolithic categories one way or another. When you were talking then, it reminded me of, this feeling of like when you go to have your hair cut as a man, and it's like, for me, it's the only time that I would read one of those like men's magazines, right. And it's always full of things that I'm supposed to really like, because I'm a man. And it's the most bizarre thing. It's always something to do with a shark attack. There's always a shark attack in there. There's always something to do with like, some guns or something, some extreme, like someone who broke their back, surfing, and then something to do with like which of these things have the most protein in. Like those are the sort of categories that I'm supposed to be like utterly riveted by, and I just don't believe it, really. I just believe that probably on balance, someone somewhere has sat with a spreadsheet and figured out that if you put all of those things in, you sell 6% more magazines, month on month, than if you didn't.
Yeah, I used to work on Time Out magazine many moons ago, years ago, and it was when Time Out was selling, we could sell 100,000 copies in a week, if you can imagine that. But you could also sell 80,000 copies the next week, and there was an awful lot of, part of it is woo-woo, part of it is because people have made a certain decision to put something on the cover and it's sold, then that was your decision and you did it, kind of thing. But it did seem to be that if you put somebody in a red dress on the cover, red kind of popped out on the newsstand.
But I think your use of woo is really important there, Suzi, though, right? Because it's the way that like woo can become fact. They're not two separate categories. It's kind of, we overdetermine it in retrospect. It's like something happens that wasn't that could have been because the weather was nice, or because, add a million different variables why something might be more successful than something else. So that then becomes an internalized truth for industry X, which means that they put more marketing spend behind the things that they think will do better. It's like, well, let's do more of the red dress stuff. Let's really go behind the red dress. And of course, because the energy is now behind the red dress, that actually does do a little bit better. And before you know it, what was actually just a cultural accident becomes an industry truth, because culture is so complex as to more or less be random. But when you've got like, thousands of people whose job depends on essentially being able to read the runes, it's natural that they in order to kind of sense a feeling of control, you begin to sort of tell yourself, well, we know that this kind of thing does this and this kind of thing does that. And I would love to run an experiment one day, because that's the trouble, is you can never do the counter history, right? What if you'd have done the exact opposite? Is just go to Penguin Random House or someone like that and say, let's sort this out once and for all. Give me your entire marketing budget for a year. You do all of your carefully calibrated data analysis. I will pick things off the slush pile. We'll allocate marketing randomly, and we'll actually run a control experiment about what the market wants. What this so-called market wants. I'm not saying I'd be right, but I think the difference would be way smaller than the marketing departments would like to think.
What an exciting idea. I love the idea, because there's also things like there are things that work, and putting posters in tube stations apparently works, and on stations generally, not just the tube. And certainly when I was working on the books desk of the Independent on Sunday, what didn't work was putting adverts in national newspapers on books pages, much to my chagrin. It was incredibly difficult. So we had to have kind of shoe adverts and, barber jacket adverts or whatever on the pages. So
I don't want to sound kind of too cynical or ungrateful, and certainly I'm a beneficiary of these big publishing companies, and I've been very lucky with the support my books have gotten. But even within this like rarefied air, that I accept that I'm in, and I'm very grateful for, all of that amounts to this sort of can be quite depressing sense of inevitability around a writer. The moment you know how much your book's been acquired for, you can extrapolate how much the marketing spend will be, and you can extrapolate out from there, how long the tail will be, how long the support will be, whether or not you'll get those posters in tube stations or whatever the case may be. A lot of the hits seem really preordained, and the only thing that jumps them out of that are the things that are kind of somewhat out of people's control. Prize listings, and so on can of course change the destiny of a book. But making that jump organically from mid-list or a low list, whatever, and whereas other books, it's like they've paid £2 million for that book, they're not going to let it fail. They need to recoup on that, and one of the best ways of doing that is seemingly convince people that it's already a hit. So before it's even out, it's the must read, it's the tube station, it's the massive pile at the front of Waterstones, and
there's all of that. I mean, from my level as former lit ed and reviewer, it's kind of poignant, because you get all these books in and they say things like, sure to be the breakout hit of 2023, 2022, whatever. And then, a year later, you pick it up and think, whatever happened to that? It's because I think the other thing is that there's just sort of too much. There's too much that, like, there's a lot more than you know, one little reviewer can kind of cope with, or even a team of reviewers. But let us get back to your book, actually, before we moan too much about publishing.
Which is the surefire hit of the year, I must say.
It is. I'm hoping, and you know, it may win a baggie. It's very early days, but it may win a baggie. You never know. So the characters, and I am going to focus on the guys for a moment, or on all the characters. They don't give the impression of being educated to a high degree, in the sense that some of them have had to leave school, get to work, go on a building site, all this sort of stuff, and they're, you know, building family relationships, starting to have kids, all that kind of thing. But they are bright, and they occasionally kind of surprise you with a reference. I think it's Patrick who says, "I don't like poetry," but at the same time, there's an imaginative response to what's going on around them, and one of them, I can't remember which one it is, actually uses the term Ouroboros, if I've got that right. You know, the symbol of eternity, the snake eating its tail. And I wondered whether you'd just like to comment a bit about that. You know, they're not educated to a high degree, but they're smart and thoughtful.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for kind of for noticing that as well. I really wanted to push against two kind of tropes that exist with the depiction of like working class communities, working class interiorities. Let's say the book is largely interior. So there are some things that they think that they've not necessarily said out loud, you know, which is important distinction. But the, you know, one of the archetypes is this kind of like, it's grim up north, you know, just misery upon misery upon misery. And another is a kind of like extended sort of bacchanalia is another, you know, another trope, right? It's just like, it's just a sort of 300-page party scene, you know, because that
Manchester kind of thing.
Exactly, you know? Right.
Yeah,
so you know, you kind of get misery or misery or
mental.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. And actually, you know, as someone who grew up, you know, with these communities, and you know, they're still my friends and my family now, but who has moved through, you know, going off to university and, you know, moving in different kind of class strata. The people I grew up with were, without question, the most linguistically inventive, funny, drawn towards metaphor, linguistically audacious. You know, the idea of coining phrases and words was a big thing. You know, storytellers, they were poetic people. They had an eye for these kind of like strange, like private theologies, you know, these sort of strange and morbid turns of phrase. There was this incredible richness of thought and language. And I just really wanted to honor that. Because I remember thinking, you know, at 18, oh wow, I'm going to get even more of that, you know, as I, you know, and I must admit, I got significantly less, because I got less first principles thinking, and I certainly got less audacity. So I really wanted to, you know, honor the depth of that interior world and the depth of that symbolic world, and also a depth of political commitment as well, which is often very, very present, just maybe not necessarily in the kind of codified ways that, you know, that we're used to seeing in kind of what I would call kind of liberal fiction. So yeah, thank you, and yes, that was really important for me to honor that.
They kind of think beyond their situation, and then there's this continual turning back and thinking, but I'm stuck here. But then it kind of opens out again, and then maybe a bit like the Hourglass or something, you know, they sort of, there are these wonderful moments where their perspective opens out and they could be more than they are, but they are kind of defeated in a way. I mean, there are forces against them. I don't want to go into the plot particularly, but there are pretty significant forces ranged against them.
Yeah, I think that's right, and partly that's material, as you point out. Partly this is, you know, that literal sense of, you know, kind of horizon, you know, that the largeness of one's ambitions and the relative tininess of one's reality. But it is also a tension that exists sort of psychologically, I think, and I think we all carry that, you know, in a way. You know, I don't necessarily buy this in its totality, but there is that idea that, you know, as we have let go of the notion of a perfect being, right, in the form of God, we have replaced, in many cases, the idea of a perfect being with a version of like perfect us, you know, the perfect Suzi, the perfect Keiran, that made all the right choices, right? And in doing so, fulfilled this nebulous idea of potential, right? Fulfilled your potential, lived the biggest life possible, became all you could be, walked through the Suzi-shaped hole in the universe, right? And we carry that like kind of in us, and it's a kind of tyrant, you know, in many ways. You know, it can be an inspiration and a guide, but it's a kind of tyrant, because it often does set this, you know, this kind of inescapable tension that can, you know, ossify into dissatisfaction, you know, pretty quickly, if we don't, I guess, without sounding too cheesy, sort of, you know, do that deeper inner work, to realize that kind of it's all where we stand.
I think it's why I like the Romantic poets, because they're always grasping for the ungraspable and reaching, and but they did seem to live rather unhappy lives and die young. So there's this terrible paradox there.
That's right.
It didn't really get them very far.
That's right. I mean, because the Romantic kind of the Romantic codification of the Epiphany was very much feeling small in the face of the massive, wasn't it? You know, like when Shelley says, like, to gaze into the everlasting wonder of things, or whatever, to be like tiny. They were never just sat there feeling tiny. They always had to be on a mountain or next to an ocean. You know, it was always by contrast. So, you know, like, I'm so small, but the universe is so vast, and in that difference, I feel, you know, I feel meaning or being, like, opening up. So I think that's exactly it. It's like, you know, how does that giant idea percolate down into like individual, you know, individual lives lived under individual systems in individual places?
Let's discuss some of the characters. Ollie, there's a very attractive character, Ollie. I mean, did you have an idea? You have these 5. Did you think they each represent something, or were you one of these writers that the characters just spoke to me? They told me who they were. I'm not really getting that from you, but
no.
How did you build?
Yeah, it's sort of trying to thread the needle a little bit here, but it's not that they all were kind of archetypes in some way. It's not that, you know, X character represented one thing and X character represented another, because I very much wanted, firstly, a lot of overlap between the characters, because of course their hearts and minds were formed in relation to one another as they grew. So it's natural that they'll kind of be, you know, intertwined, and I try and replicate that in some of the sort of narrative structure, in fact. And they're all on this journey of exactly as you pointed out, this kind of tension between remaining and escaping, right? And in an odd way, you know, Ollie, who has, I don't think, you know, he has addiction issues in the him and Rian are actually the two that escape. It's just he escapes in and Rian escapes out, right? But they're the two that get the furthest away, you know, in an odd sense. So yeah, it's kind of, they don't represent like X, Y, or Z, but they didn't equally just sort of like spring to me. They kind of were constructed in relation to one another. And I mean, this is a bit more esoteric, but I was always drawn to readings of literature where you sort of pretended for a moment that there was only one character, right? So, you know, the parable of the prodigal son, which is a weird parable in lots of ways, and it's one that people often struggle with, because they're like, well, why, you know, why does the errant son get the same? Well, it makes a load of sense if you realize you're all three characters, right? You're the father, you're the son, and you're the prodigal son, right? And it's about the reunification of all of those aspects of yourself, right? Like Othello is a much more interesting play if you believe that Iago and Othello are one character, you know, with this kind of fractured consciousness. So I'm not saying that is the case with this book, but it was kind of in the back of my mind on some level, that maybe there is only one character in the book, you know, refracted in different ways. There's five, but you know what I'm saying.
I mean, that's almost a metaphysical point, isn't it? That we all are each other in some kind of a way, you know.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And I love the way it's very interior, as you say, and the voice, you know, the narration moves from character to character, and they have the same thoughts, slightly different approach to the thoughts, and they remember the same things. And one of the funny things that then just sort of become a tragic thing is when somebody falls in the lake and a goose laughs at them, or a duck laughs at them, or something. And they all remember this. This is just this sort of, there's just something about friendship and the kind of goofing around that they'll, it's fair to say that I think this metaphor is in it about a string. The string is kind of pulled almost to bursting, but as long as they can remember the laughing goose, it will not exactly break, you know, it will never quite break.
Well, it's a funny thing, isn't it? Because we seem to have got there with the notion of love, romantic love, in that it's now very commonplace because people have read those like pop psychology books, you know, about love languages, or, you know, or Lover's Discourse by Roland Barthes. Not that that's a pop book, but you know what I mean. The people create private languages within their relationship, like kind of everyone accepts that, right? But that principle applies much, much more widely than just within romantic love. I think we create shared rhythms and shared metaphors and shared stories, shared languages within friendship groups, and then even, you know, it may get less shared, but I think it still reverberates even further into, you know, socioeconomic groups and so on and so forth. So I really wanted to have some of that, you know, sense of sharedness. And it's always, you know, this is certainly not a complaint, but it's always interesting to me when, you know, a reviewer or a reader like assumes that you did it by accident, you know, that maybe you just didn't know any other words, you know, that maybe this writer only knew 14 words and he keeps repeating the same word, and as if it were just, you know, an error, as opposed to a deliberate choice. But you know, I'm not complaining. I'm just pointing that out.
I'm just finding something that I sort of turn down the edges of the paper as I read, the edges of the pages, and I loved this bit. I mean, you know, there are breaks and schisms and all sorts of things. I left and it felt like an ending, like maybe there should have been loose ends and second chances and false restarts, but there weren't, and there won't be. Escape velocity, how it takes almost all of the fuel to get a rocket out of the Earth's atmosphere, but then after that it will basically run on air. Leaving is like that too. Takes all of your energy to do it, but once you've broken through the membrane of the place that is holding you, it's all over. Maybe they were both better off there anyway, better off somewhere else. I mean, I just think that's such a great image. I love that image that, yeah, the hardest thing is the escape velocity, which is something, as we've discussed, everybody's trying to do. The first step is the hardest. And there's lots of moments like that in the book where these characters have a kind of breakthrough. They see something in a new way. And it goes back to what you were saying about people operating on first principles, you know, not filtering absolutely everything through a book that they read. You know, they're really living these lives, and they might seem like small lives or reduced lives in some way, but they are really living them, and that is what comes across.
Yeah, that's
in the book.
That's really wonderful to hear, actually. Thank you, Suzi. I mean, my agent said something to me about this book that really stuck with me. And I don't think she was insulting my first novel when she said it, but Hourglass, which you referenced previously, is a much more literary book in terms of its references. You know, the character is kind of knowingly well-read and pretentious. Yeah, knowingly, I must say. And my agent said something to me. She said, "Oh, Keiran, the reason you're getting a much more emotional response to this second book, which I certainly have been so far," she said, "is your first book was about life, and your second book is about living, and people are much more interested in books about living." And I hadn't really kind of made that distinction before, but it was a generous one, and I'm stealing it.
No, that's wonderful. What a great thing to say. I mean, let's move to Patrick, and there's a lot about Patrick's job, which is very much a job of our era. I mean, when you come up with something like that, he's basically he delivers people's food, and there's a funny bit but also a very poignant bit where he explains how it's put him off food altogether. I mean, I worked in a pub once, not for very long, and I also have a chip shop background, so for a very long time you can't abide either chips or beer, which certainly makes you a sort of strange person when you're a student, for example.
Yeah, that's two of my favorite things there. But no, I mean, yeah, you're right. I mean, I've always been work labor is wage labor, to put it more precisely, is a big part of all of my writing, and I'm always struck by the differential between the extent to which it fills up a human life and the extent to which it shows up in literature. And you know, we can speculate about the reasons why that might be the case, but there's a differential, and it's stark. And sticking on that idea of differential, the reason I was really drawn to essentially a kind of like Deliveroo, Uber Eats driver, you know, job is because, as you say, they're very emblematic in lots of ways. One, because of the difference between how it's presented and how it actually is. So, you know, it's presented as this symbol of freedom, you know, like sushi delivered at any time, and it's like, freedom for who? Right? The reality is it's like exhausted people getting food delivered to them in box rooms by even more exhausted people on, you know, exploitative contracts. And it's never sushi, it's always McDonald's, which is the biggest you know, delivery volume by factors. You know, it never shows up on the posters. Obviously, it's always a, you know, ramen or something like that, and, you know, some very attractive bowl. So there's all of those ways in which it's not how it's, you know, how it's presented, and the brutality of intensified labor at that end of the economy is really hard to overstate. We talk a lot about precariousness, you know, precarity as a material thing, but it's also a physical thing. It's a psychic thing. I would argue it's a spiritual thing, and, you know, it affects people in such a way. It's a tool. It's, you know, it's a tool of governance, precarity, because you make people precarious in all of those ways. You can then sell them policies of security very easily. You know, there's a relationship between those two halves of the equation. And then lastly, and because I have to stop myself once I start on this sort of thing, is I was really, really taken by the fact that these companies created in a way the archetype of the atomized worker, right? Like, no office, no nothing, just driving around on a bicycle, right? Or a moped or whatever. But then in their greed, because they can't really make profit, right, at the moment, the only thing that gets squeezed again and again is labor costs, right? Chain. So in their greed, they said, oh, I've got an idea. All of the drivers, rather than just driving around, we want you all to gather in these particular places that have a high density of takeaway restaurants, because then you'll be able to do the orders quicker, you know, and therefore make us more money. And also we're going to build some dark kitchens that just have like restaurants in them, just for, you know, delivery purposes. So we're going to make some more money that way. And what they'd done, because they're idiots, is they'd accidentally replicated the break room. So they'd taken all of these atomized workers and they put them all on a street corner together. And of course, what happens? They suddenly do consciousness raising. They're suddenly like, hang on, it's not just me that's angry. We're all angry. So all of the strikes that have come to Deliveroo and Uber Eats have come because of their greed, where they took their atomized workers and reconnected them. And they also didn't realize that it's very hard to picket 415 different Chinese restaurants. It's very easy to pick in one dark kitchen and stop all the restaurants at once. So they actually undermined their own, you know, their own kind of economic and business structures there through their own greed and kind of illiteracy of labor practices. So there's some, I only mention all that because I think it's not that there's something specific about that particular job, but it's emblematic of a bunch of things that are going on, you know, in our economy. And it's also a broadly invisible job in, it's one of the most visible jobs in the world. You know, we see them everywhere. And where is it in our literature? You know, where is it? If I have to read another book about someone working in a bookshop, as though it's the most common job in the world. You know, so anyway, I'll cut myself off there for everyone's benefit. But
I mean, it's a bit of a side issue, but I'm always struck with TV ads for fast food where people are entranced by it, hypnotized by it. People are sort of going, oh, and it's certainly not how I feel about any form of fast food at all. But it's really strange how it's presented, that your eyes get big and your pupils dilate and you practically salivate and you go like this and then you go, and what are they selling here? It's maybe it's part of all this. I don't know, but
I think it is. I think it's all in there. I think it's very complex because there's also, you know, clearly a class coded element to the way we think about food, the way we think about consumption and control. You know, Rian in the book, for example, even in his wealth, has moments of kind of coming home and like ordering fried chicken on the way home, like eating too much of it, throwing up. There's something that you can't shake there that is quite class coded. I mean, no one ever looks disgusted at someone and says, God, that man just ate so much pate. He was just stuffing the pate down his face. I was so disgusted by it, you know, because what exactly is it that, you know, that creates that type of judgment? Yeah, and as you say, the marketing stuff is very interesting. I mean, it's like that old film Falling Down, right, where the guy ends up kind of going on a killing spree because he orders the burger that looks amazing, but actually it's kind of, you know, it's actually terrible. And you're just like, yeah, that burger is a brilliant metaphor for like life. You know, yeah, I'm certain I didn't quite get what I ordered.
So Patrick's the delivery driver, and Rian is the kind of magic money man, which again is interesting because he sort of does nothing really. He's the guy who, as he says, I've got loads of money and I just use it to make more money, and why doesn't everybody do that? And it can't work that way. And Connor and also Ollie, they're building site guys, and there's also quite a bit about, I mean, I guess this is classic working class culture, male working class, you know, work really hard, work incredibly hard physically, and then drink and drink and drink because it's the only thing that kind of takes the pain away. So that's another big aspect of the book, the sheer sheer physicality. And this
100%.
this new build, they're doing a new build, aren't they? And some of the old lads complained that it's taking the sky away.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Yeah, but you're right. I think the physicality is so important. I mean, there's so many people who I went to school with who went straight onto building sites at 15, 16, and their bodies are broken by 40. You know, the degree to which even in a broadly kind of service-based tertiary economy, we still hold on to the fungibility of working class bodies. It's just, well, you know, throw them into the mix, and when they break, there'll be another million bodies we can just throw in to replace them. There is a deep physicality, and it's very linked to well, I could go on forever about that. You're just to say, yes, the physical aspect is very important, and of course it doesn't stop with the body. You know, your body and your mind are, you know, intimately linked. And yeah, that sense that everyone has of like, oh no, not they swapped me in for my father. You know, like, please God, I don't want to swap my children in for me. You know, that sort of desperation to sort of break that cycle, while simultaneously being told that, you know, one of the only routes out of your scenario is to depressingly like build some more new build properties to extract rent from the very communities that raised you. You know, it's you know, it's a very sort of depressing cycle. The book's not as depressing as I'm making it sound. I must say.
Well, it's full of ideas that are not, you know, that they're not kind of told. You kind of, as I say, it's a lived book, and you can kind of pull ideas out of it. The ideas are sort of the basis of the story, and the story is a simple one. And as you say, it is not, you know, it has tragic elements, it has comic elements, and it has sort of wonderful, sort of life affirming elements as well. It's historically minded. It's also about the now, very much about today. So it's yeah, completely wonderful. I see buildings fall like lightning. I did not get the reference, but I love the reference, the biblical reference in the title. How are we doing? Yeah, let us go on to my 3 questions now, which I'm continuing to ask everybody. I asked everybody throughout all of last year, and I decided not to ask writers what their favorite book was, because it's kind of impossible. I mean, you know, sometimes people throw one out anyway, but so the question that seemed to get very interesting answers was favorite artwork, and people have had album covers and I think posters and all sorts. We can interpret it very broadly. What did you go for?
I was depressingly literal in thinking about this question. So I've actually maybe not that literal. So this isn't my favorite piece of art. You know, I'm very drawn to kind of slightly outsiderish art generally. I love like Charlotte Salomon and Henry Darger, who I'm writing about at the moment, and those kind of people. But the answer to the question that I chose was the Iron Man statue, which sits in Birmingham Town Centre, which is by Anthony Gormley, and it's the reason I chose it was because it just seems to capture a bunch of things that I find like appealing and also funny, amongst which are, one, it's public art, and that really matters to me. It's not you know, it's not something that's being like acquired in a gallery by a person in order to abstractly generate, you know, value as though it were a stock or a share. This is a piece of art commissioned by, you know, by a city, by a and put on public display for everyone to use and to climb on when they're drunk, which is what people do. So that's important to me. It's also important that it's kind of rubbish. So it's like nowhere near as good as like Angel of the North. It has none of the gravitas. It has none of the grace. So there's something very Birmingham about that. Just sort of like what, you know, it's like the intent is amazing, but the sort of execution's not quite there. But crucially, why this is the thing I love most about it. So it's kind of like, I mean, it's an Iron Man in the sort of like Iron Maiden sense of the word. It's like a kind of sarcophagus type thing, right? And it sits in the town, like in the sort of civic centre, so near the sort of like council buildings and the courts and so on, kind of wonky and rusty. And it was supposed to represent Birmingham's industrial past, right? And the way that that was kind of giving way to this modern city that has grown up around it, you know, more recently. But it kind of rusted. And then there was some debate about whether it was supposed to rust in order to represent the kind of falling away of the industrial past, which is quite an interesting idea, that it kind of decays in, you know, publicly, but it didn't decay enough, right? So you've got this kind of you know, this sort of like perpetual thing that's hanging on all the time, while the modernity of the city that it was supposed to celebrate has come and gone. So all of the kind of like, you know, new build flats with like plastic facades and like Subway sandwiches and all this stuff that was supposed to be, you know, this great new modern city are now like empty high streets, you know, slightly sad looking city centres. You know, we've had decade or more of austerity. We've had 30 years of like disastrous kind of neoliberal excavation of the civic. And yet this kind of odd, slightly funny, slightly rubbish, slightly decayed like public artwork remains. And there's all of those things together make a very appealing kind of object to me. So that's my answer.
You do mention something in the afterword or the acknowledgements in the book where you talk about public luxury. What, I mean, this doesn't sound very luxurious, really. This sounds a little bit makeshift, but what did you mean by that? Do you mean things like you know, the Bolshoi ballet with cheap tickets for the workers and beautiful metro stops in St. Petersburg or whatever? Is it that kind of, you know, a commitment to ordinary working people that they can have swimming pools and libraries and opera?
Sure. I mean, as a starter for 10, absolutely. You know, it's the roses part of bread and roses, right? We don't just have an unequally distributed access to money. We have an unequally distributed access to luxury and to beauty, and increasingly to art, and that's a great tragedy as well. And shared luxury, you know, as you say, civic things, libraries, you know, are a perfect example. It's like, you know, they're communally owned, they're not for profit, they're beautiful, there's, you know, they you know, they're well loved, and yet, you know, we don't need to go into what's happened to them. Yeah, public luxury and private sufficiency is the model. You know, not everyone can have a swimming pool, but we can probably have a swimming pool between every 20 people, and think what that would be like. You know, maybe not everyone can have you know, a 4-wheel drive, but we can have a free and accessible and green public transport system and air that we can breathe. All of these things aren't hair shirts. They are types of luxury that we're being, you know, that we're being denied in exchange for this kind of grasping, you know, private thrust for luxury, which undoes itself anyway, because, you know, who wants to govern over a broken castle? You know, who wants to, you know, drive their shiny car past, you know, a street full of homeless people and empty shops? Like, it's, you know, no one wins. Of course, some people lose more than others, but there's no real winners, you know, under a system like that. So yeah, that matters a lot to me, both in theory and also because I was of the generation that just about benefited from some of the remnants of that kind of post-war settlement. You know, just about, it was kind of being, you know, sort of phased out by Blair. But it still made me, a lot of the changes that happened in my life couldn't happen now. To, you know, to someone coming from where I came from. You know, there are no EMA grants, there are no, you know, the scheme that sent me to university no longer exists. You know, these things are no longer there, and the good things that still exist are remnants. They're remnants of a different ideological time. You know, whether we're talking about the NHS or something like that, we're clinging on to them, but they're remnants. I can't even imagine any of these sort of existing sort of Overton politicians here even doing something as basic as building pavements or roads. You know, like as basic as that. You walk down the road and you think, who built this pavement? When did this pavement come into existence? Let alone setting up, you know, a bus network, let alone, you know, all of these things are, you know, are echoes of a different time where politics, at least to some extent, mediated the will and the needs of the people. That mediation is gone. It's gone. 60 million people could ask for something and they would be roundly ignored. You know, so yeah, yeah, public luxury and statues included.
Statues included. I remember when I was a radio critic, one of the funniest programs I ever listened to was a couple of artists whinging about doing public sculpture and going, you know, the council have said that it mustn't be dangerous and it mustn't, you know, people mustn't slip near it. And this is totally impacting on my artistic vision. Like, it's not meant to fall over and kill a kid, you know, but.
Yeah, I mean, poor them. I mean, they could always make a safe public sculpture and just push a child over in their spare time if they really needed to, you know, fulfill both of those needs.
Exactly. Let us move on to my second question. I'm just thinking about Anthony Courtney going around shoving children now. It wasn't him, by the way.
No, I hear he does do that, though. I do hear he does do
He's
that.
Terrible. He's terrible. So, what I'm calling the Book of Shame. You're very, very well read, but there must be a book out there that you think, I should have read that by now.
Oh, there's so many. There's so many. So all of my sort of academic training or whatever is in literature. So I'm very aware of the massive gaps, put it that way. So there's at first I thought there's whole genres that I'm completely kind of illiterate in. You know, I don't read sci-fi, for example, even though, like, on many levels, especially politically, I know that there will be books out there that I love. I'm really rubbish at reading historical fiction, which is just terrible for me, really. I mean, whenever I pick up a book and it says on the back, set against the backdrop of, I'm just like, no. Set against the backdrop of nothing, please. But the one that really stands out is I've never read, and this is a me problem. I've never read any Jane Austen at all, not one bit. And you know why this is just because, you know, just such a good example of how you know, we injure ourselves more than the world injures us. You know, I just got into some stupid argument when I was about 18, 19, you know, something like that, and I just said, oh, why do I want to read books about, like, you know, tedious, like, aristocrats being like witty to each other in drawing rooms or something, which I'm fully aware is an absolutely, like, egregious like misrepresentation of what those books are. But for some reason, I sort of like held that opinion relentlessly, for, and then just never got around to it. I mean, I no longer hold that opinion. I even if the books were about that, that's fine. I like lots of books like that. But I've never actually got around to filling in that gap, and I know that I should, because basically everyone I love and everyone whose opinions I respect tells me I'm very wrong. So I should. That's my choice, Jane Austen.
I don't know how you escaped at school. I mean, we had to we had to do Emma for O level, and then we had to do it again for A level. So that did put me off.
Our version of that weirdly was Educating Rita, the screenplay of Educating Rita. They just had us reading that over and over again.
Oh God!
And then Of Mice and Men. Those were the ones. Yeah.
Oh, you see, I wonder whether that would be my book of shame. I've never read any Steinbeck, but I've never had any desire to, so I'm not particularly ashamed. But every so often I think, oh, they do sound like, there's something going on there that I should check out. But
you've probably imbibed it, by default, just by listening to like Bruce Springsteen, over the years.
Yeah, exactly.
You've got the main ideas, right?
Yeah.
It was hard on the Dust Bowl.
Yeah, exactly. Or, kind of American protest songs or something. Yeah. Right. Oh, yes. So the last question. What is the weirdest or funniest feedback you've ever had on any aspect of your work? And it could come from anywhere. It could be something an agent has said, or a bookseller, or a reader, or Goodreads, if you dare go there. What's weirdest or funniest feedback?
Yeah, so when I was writing Hourglass, I sort of set myself I set myself lots of rules, but one of them was when I was going through and editing it, I was like, look, if I've seen this image before, if it's familiar to me, it's going. I want to strip out a lot of and I was also stripping out the kind of the stuff that there's too much of in novels. It's like they put their hand on the door handle, they press the door handle down, they walk through the door. It's like, I know how someone gets into a door, like I've walked through a door, you can just put the character inside, it's fine. But anyway, so I really tried to lean into this idea that you get to the universal through the specific, right? So there's lots of weird things happen in that book. And I thought I'd written this book about desire and labor and politics and time and all this stuff, but the thing I get emails and messages about more than anything, and it's by a distance, if you put them on a bar graph, it's like all the stuff I thought the book was about, and then this other bar up here. And the bar is, there's a scene in the book where the two characters go to bed with each other for the first time, and after the woman leaves, the guy finds a ball of hair on the floor from where she sort of washed her hair and brushed it, and he eats it. He eats this ball of hair, this wet ball of hair, and and he points out that it turns out you need water to eat hair even if the hair's wet. There's this kind of whole thing. And anyway, the amount of people who've messaged me and just sort of say something along the lines of, I've also eaten my lover's hair, there's like some version of that, is a piece of feedback I had a lot on that book. And then one last one, because it happened enough to be noteworthy, is something that happens when you write a book that does reasonably well, or enough for your sort of publisher to send you out of London, is you go to these parts of the country where people come to your book reading because they go to every book reading, right? It's not you specifically, it's just they just go, and I actually love that. I find it fantastic. But as I went through that process 5 or 6, 7, 8, 9 times, something happened to me 3 times, which was at the end of the reading, a woman would come up to me. They were always kind of, say, 60 plus, and they would come up to me and say, I read your book, and there's 3 separate instances of erectile dysfunction in Hourglass. And someone would come up to me and say, I just wanted to say, my husband had that problem, and this is what we did about it. And then they would give me whatever their like homemade, remedy was. And of course, I'm grateful that they've read the book. But, you feel like pointing out, one, that's not me, just to be clear. Two, it happens to everyone. So even if it was me, that's not a problem. That's also not a problem. And three, it did just make me think that we have this debate, within literary circles and, journalism circles about this crisis of identification. It's like people can't help but like want to identify with a character, or they can't help identifying the author with the voice, or, all of that stuff. And it turns out that like that is really, really true. Because going around these bookshops, I was just the weird man from Hourglass, to these, to these readers. So yeah, that's my story.
That has reminded me, especially the hair bit, has reminded me of something that I picked up in IC buildings. Which I mean, you say everything's meant, but I wonder if this is meant. It probably is. The men who are thinking about the women that they love or that they fancy or that they want to go out with, there are a couple of references to smell, which seem to be perfume. And I wondered, am I doing exactly what those ladies are doing? Do you like perfume, Keiran? Do you like ladies' perfume? There are a couple of references to.
Well, there's no way to answer that question without sounding creepy, is there? But actually, do you know what? You have caught me there, because I am really, really particular about smell. Not just ladies' perfume, but it's something I take a lot of care of on myself. I spend way too much money on aftershave. It's one of my like big expenses, like unjustifiable expenses. A lot of my sort of my erotic memory from childhood is linked to like particular perfumes and smells so it gets like reactivated. And it only occurred to me recently about this, but this sounds crazy because we've met in real life, so I'm quite a tall, big person, right? Might not be showing up on camera, but I'm a very tall man. I haven't grown since I was about 11, so I was this giant kid, right? Like massive kid, to the point that like I was, elite at all sports, even though I had no aptitude for them, because I was just I'm grown up effectively playing with these tiny children. And the parents would complain, like, why is this man with a beard like playing rugby against my child? But I realized that I think what came with that, like, early puberty, was this sense of like, that I was always kind of sweatier and hairier and spottier than all of my peers, and I was petrified of being thought of as like unclean. Like it was it really bothered me. And I think then I generated this kind of this kind of oversensitivity to always trying to like smell nice. Even now, all these decades later, I'll find myself buying emergency packets of chewing gum on the way to meet a friend for a pint, even though I brushed my teeth before I left the house, just in case, because when I hug him, I want to make sure that like my breath is nice for this man who clearly doesn't care. So no, you're totally right. I think you've identified something like somewhere between a preference and a neurosis in me there.
Oh. Well, it's kind of one I share, so it's why I picked up on that, I'm sure. So when we do meet next time in person, I would attempt to get a waft.
Oh yeah,
of your lovely aftershave. That will be very nice indeed. Keiran Goddard, it has been an absolute pleasure talking to you about this book again. Yeah, a wonderful, wonderful novel. Thank you so much for dropping into the book bag. I will wave goodbye, hang around
Thanks
for a
having
moment.
me, Suzi. It's been great. Thank you.
Really lovely to chat. And yes, so that's the first interview of 2024. Hope you enjoyed it. I see buildings fall like lightning. I think you can tell that I loved it. It only came out last week. It's very new. And we'll be looking forward to hearing a lot more from Keiran Goddard in the future. Thank you very much for watching. Like and subscribe if you are able, and catch me next time on Suzi's Book Bag. Thank you. Goodbye.